they called us the silent species. Across 17 star systems, through 43 first contacts, and, during 27 years of galactic membership, humanity had never once raised its voice in anger. We smiled. We traded. We built. We helped rebuild after disasters that weren't even our fault. When the Kethvar Confederacy glassed 3 human colonies, we filed diplomatic protests. When the Zephyrian Empire enslaved our outer rim settlements, we negotiated for humanitarian access. When alien pirates raided our supply convoys, we increased security and kept shipping. The galaxy learned to see humans as the useful idiots of space. Strong enough to be valuable, too peaceful to be dangerous. We became the medics, the engineers, the negotiators that everyone called when they needed someone reliable, someone who wouldn't shoot first and ask questions later. But the thing about silence is this: it's not empty. It's waiting. And when humanity finally opened its mouth to speak, the words that came out weren't diplomatic. They weren't peaceful. They weren't what anyone expected from the species that had spent 3 decades being the galaxy's favorite doormat. The words were simple: no more. What followed changed everything. Part 1. The emergency session of the Galactic Coalition was supposed to be routine. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had attended hundreds of these meetings over her 15-year career, sitting in the human delegation's modest section while more powerful species debated the fate of systems humanity would never see. Today felt different only because of the weight in her chest, the documents in her briefcase, and the knowledge that after today, nothing would ever be the same. The great amphitheater of the coalition headquarters buzzed with translated conversations. 12,000 delegates representing 400 species filled the curved tiers, their forms ranging from the elegant crystalline structures of the Veltari to the massive, slug-like bulk of the Gordhak representatives. At the center, the rotating holographic display showed real-time feeds from the Kepler 442 system, where the latest humanitarian crisis was unfolding. Elena watched the feeds with the kind of calm that only comes from having seen too much. Orbital bombardment. Civilian evacuation ships exploding in space. Children's bodies floating past camera drones. Just another Tuesday in the galactic community, it seemed. The situation in Kepler 442 requires immediate intervention, declared High Counselor Zarthek, his 4-meter frame dominating the central podium. The insectoid leader of the Tari Union gestured with all 6 arms toward the holographic displays. The hegemony's actions constitute clear violations of the Galactic Warfare Accords. A chorus of clicks and hisses erupted from the hegemony's delegation. Their leader, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a shark with a praying mantis and given it delusions of grandeur, rose to respond. The Tari twist facts like they twist their own limbs. Kepler 442 harbored terrorist elements. Our response was measured and appropriate. Elena felt her jaw clench. Measured. Appropriate. She'd heard these words applied to the destruction of entire worlds, the enslavement of billions, the casual extinction of species whose only crime was being in the wrong place when someone decided they needed Lebensraum. Perhaps, suggested the melodious voice of Counselor Lyrian from the Ethereal Collective, we should establish another fact-finding commission to investigate the situation thoroughly before taking any precipitous action. The usual murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. Fact-finding commissions were the coalition's favorite tool for looking busy while doing nothing. Elena had seen 17 of them formed during her tenure. She'd also seen the reports they filed afterward, carefully worded documents that managed to condemn atrocities without actually naming perpetrators or demanding consequences. High Counselor Zarthek nodded sagely. A reasonable proposal. All in favor of establishing Commission 7745B to investigate the Kepler 442 incident? Hands, tentacles, appendages, and energy fields rose across the amphitheater. Elena counted the votes automatically, a skill developed over years of watching democracy die by committee. It would pass, of course. It always passed. And, what of immediate humanitarian aid to the survivors? Asked a small voice from the lower tiers. Elena recognized the speaker as a representative from one of the newer coalition members, a species so recently contacted they still believed the organization stood for something. Once the commission has established the facts, Zarthek replied smoothly, appropriate measures will be taken. Elena stood up. The movement was so unexpected in the normally scripted flow of coalition meetings that conversations actually stopped. 12,000 beings turned their attention to the human section, where Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in her simple black suit, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of cosmic politics. The chair recognizes the human delegation, Zarthek said, his mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement. Humans rarely spoke during general sessions, and, when they did, it was usually to offer engineering services or medical aid. Elena walked down the steps toward the central podium, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She passed the Cathvar delegation, whose crystalline forms refracted light in beautiful patterns while they simultaneously planned the next genocide. She walked by the Zephyrian representatives, elegant humanoids who had perfected the art of looking noble while operating slave markets. She moved through the assembled representatives of a galaxy that had spent 3 decades learning that humans would accept anything, forgive anything, rebuild anything, as long as it meant avoiding conflict. When she reached the podium, Elena set down her briefcase and looked up at the 12,000 faces staring down at her. Some curious, some bored, most confident that whatever the human was about to say would be brief, polite, and ultimately irrelevant. Honorable delegates, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I stand before you today to inform this body that the human species hereby withdraws from the Galactic Coalition, effective immediately. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was the silence of a universe holding its breath, of 12,000 minds trying to process words that didn't compute with everything they knew about the species that had just spoken them. High Counselor Zarthak was the first to recover. Ambassador Vasquez, surely there has been some miscommunication. Withdrawal from the coalition requires a formal process, extensive deliberation. No miscommunication, Elena interrupted, opening her briefcase and removing a thick stack of documents. These are formal notices of withdrawal from 47 mutual defense treaties, 33 trade agreements, and every humanitarian accord we've signed over the past 27 years. As of this moment, humanity considers itself bound by none of these agreements. She began placing the documents on the podium, each one landing with a soft sound that somehow seemed to echo through the vast chamber. Furthermore, she continued, we are formally notifying all coalition members that we consider the current galactic order to be a failure. You have had 3 decades to prove that civilization can exist without meaningful consequences for atrocity. You have failed that test repeatedly. Counselor Lyrian's voice floated from the ethereal delegation, somehow managing to sound both concerned and condescending. Elena, dear, what has brought on this sudden change in humanity's position? Surely whatever grievance you have can be addressed through proper channels. Elena's laugh cut through the chamber like a blade. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Grievance? She gestured toward the holographic displays, which still showed the aftermath of the Kepler 442 bombardment. 3 billion beings died in that system last week. 3 billion. And your response is to form another committee. She opened another section of her briefcase and removed a different set of documents. These were thicker, bound in black covers, and, when she held them up, something in her posture made the entire chamber lean forward. These are comprehensive intelligence reports on every major atrocity committed in coalition space over the past 3 decades. Genocides, slave operations, weapons programs that violate every treaty ever signed. All meticulously documented, all ignored by this body, all committed by species sitting in this very chamber. The silence now had weight to it, pressing down on the assembled delegates like atmospheric pressure. You want to know what changed? Elena's voice rose, carrying clearly to every corner of the amphitheater. What changed is that we're done pretending that nice words and diplomatic processes mean anything to beings who see kindness as weakness and restraint as invitation. She pulled out one final document, this one sealed with unfamiliar markings. As of this moment, humanity is implementing the Solar Quarantine Protocol. All human worlds are closed to outside traffic. All human ships are returning to our territory. All human citizens living in alien space have 48 hours to reach human-controlled systems or they will be considered lost. High Counselor Zarthak's mandibles clicked rapidly. You cannot simply isolate yourselves from galactic civilization. Trade routes, resource agreements, the infrastructure will survive without us, I'm sure, Elena said calmly. After all, you've spent 3 decades treating humanity as a convenient service provider rather than an equal partner. I'm sure you'll manage. She closed her briefcase and turned to walk back toward the human delegation section. But then, she stopped, looked back over her shoulder at the 12,000 beings staring at her, and smiled. It was the same smile humans had been giving the galaxy for 30 years, polite and accommodating and seemingly harmless. Except now, somehow, it wasn't. One more thing, Elena said, her voice conversational. The human warships currently stationed throughout Coalition space under various mutual defense agreements? As of our withdrawal, they're no longer bound by Coalition rules of engagement. She paused, letting that sink in. They're coming home. But they might make a few stops along the way to settle some old accounts. I'd recommend that certain species with particularly egregious human blood on their hands might want to ensure their orbital defenses are up to date. She walked back to her seat, gathered her delegation, and left the chamber. Behind her, 12,000 beings sat in stunned silence, trying to understand what had just happened. For 3 decades, they had known exactly what to expect from humanity: complaints without consequences, protests without power, principles without teeth. None of them noticed the faint vibration starting in the station's hull. None of them realized that the vibration was caused by human warships, dozens of them, taking positions around the Coalition headquarters. None of them understood that the species they had dismissed as harmlessly idealistic had just declared war on the galactic status quo itself. But they were about to learn. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching through the main viewport as Coalition Station Alpha grew larger against the starfield. The massive structure housed the galactic government that had spent 3 decades treating humanity as a useful but, ultimately disposable member species. Today, that relationship was going to change permanently. Admiral called her communications officer, Lieutenant Torres. We're receiving multiple hails from Coalition vessels. They're demanding to know our intentions. Sarah didn't turn from the viewport. Around the station, she could see the running lights of 47 human warships taking positions in a perfect sphere. Ships that had been scattered across the galaxy under mutual defense treaties, ships that had spent years protecting alien worlds and trade routes, ships that had never once been allowed to fire on enemies of humanity itself. Tell them our intentions are simple, Sarah said quietly. We're here to collect our ambassador and ensure her safe passage home. They're pointing out that Ambassador Vasquez is in no danger, that this show of force is unnecessary, Lieutenant. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 20 years in space, 15 of them watching human colonies burn while the Coalition formed committees to discuss the situation. Tell them that humanity no longer recognizes Coalition authority over human military assets. We'll withdraw when we're satisfied our people are safe. She turned to her tactical officer. Commander Park, what's the status of our friends? Commander Park consulted his displays, where dozens of contacts showed the positions of alien warships trying to respond to humanity's sudden show of force. 17 Coalition vessels attempting to form a defensive perimeter, Admiral. Mix of species, but they're having coordination problems. Sarah almost smiled. She'd fought alongside those species for years, and she knew their weaknesses. The Veltari were brilliant tacticians, but their crystalline ships were fragile. The Kethvar were aggressive but predictable. The Tari had powerful weapons but slow reaction times. They'd never worked together as a unified force because they'd never needed to. The Coalition's military had always been more of a peacekeeping force than a real fighting fleet. Any sign they're planning something stupid? Sarah asked. The Hegemony battlecruiser Inexorable is charging weapons, Park reported. They're hailing us directly. On the main screen, the angular face of a Hegemony fleet commander appeared, his shark-like features twisted in what passed for a sneer among his species. Human vessel, you are in violation of Coalition space. Stand down immediately or face the consequences. Sarah stepped forward, looking directly into the camera that would transmit her image back to the alien commander. Fleet Commander Thekvar, I presume. I've read your file. Kepler 442. Vega 7. The Centauri massacres. Quite an impressive record of butchering civilians.
The alien's black eyes narrowed.
Those were legitimate military operations against terrorist elements.
Is that what you call children now? Sarah's voice remained level, conversational.
I have orbital surveillance footage from Kepler 442. I watched your ships target evacuation vessels.
I watched you blast refugee camps. I counted the bodies.
The thing is, Sarah continued, for 3 decades, my species has been very patient with yours.
We've filed reports. We've requested investigations. We've tried every diplomatic channel the coalition offered. And, every time, we've been told that your actions were complex situations requiring nuanced understanding.
She took a step closer to the camera. But, we're not feeling very nuanced today. The alien commander bared rows of serrated teeth.
You dare threaten the hegemony?
Your pathetic fleet, he never finished the sentence. Sarah had gestured to Commander Park, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Retribution's main guns, weapons that had been designed to punch through asteroid fields and hostile planet surfaces, fired once. The hegemony battlecruiser Inexorable ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a kilometer-long symbol of tyrannical power. The next moment it was expanding plasma and scrap metal, its crew of 3,000 vaporized before they could even scream. The silence that followed across all communication channels was absolute.
All vessels, Sarah broadcast on open channels, this is Admiral Chen of the United Earth Fleet. That was a demonstration. The next ship that charges weapons on a human vessel will join the Inexorable. The ship after that will also be destroyed. We will continue this process until everyone understands the new reality. She gestured to Torres. Get me fleet-wide tactical.
The main screen shifted to show the positions of all ships in the system, human vessels marked in blue, alien ships in red. What the display showed was 47 human warships surrounding 17 alien vessels whose crews were suddenly realizing they had never actually seen human weapons fired in anger.
All human vessels, Sarah announced, you are authorized to defend yourselves by any means necessary.
Rules of engagement are as follows. Any hostile action against human personnel will be met with immediate and overwhelming force. Any attempt to detain, threaten, or harm human citizens will result in the complete destruction of the aggressor vessel and any ships supporting it. Through the comm channels, she could hear alien voices speaking rapidly in a dozen different languages, panic creeping into their tones as they tried to understand what was happening. Admiral, Commander Park reported, we're receiving a priority transmission from Coalition Command.
Put it through.
High Counselor Zarthek appeared on screen, his insectoid features broadcasting confusion and alarm.
Admiral Chen, this aggression is unacceptable.
You have destroyed a coalition vessel without provocation. Correction, Sarah interrupted. I destroyed a vessel belonging to a species that has spent the last 30 years committing genocide while you formed committees.
A species whose commander threatened human lives.
A species that opened fire on refugee ships last week. That is a matter for proper investigation. No, it isn't. Sarah's voice cut through the politicians' protests like a laser through tissue paper. It was a matter for proper investigation 30 years ago. It was a matter for proper consequences 20 years ago. It was a matter for justice 10 years ago.
Today, it's simply a matter for human judgment.
She could see other coalition leaders gathering around Zarthek, their various alien features all showing the same expression, the dawning realization that the species they had dismissed as harmlessly idealistic was pointing enough firepower at them to reduce the station to constituent atoms.
What do you want?
Zarthek asked, his diplomatic training finally overcoming his shock. What we want, Sarah said, is very simple. We want Ambassador Vasquez and her delegation safely aboard our vessels.
We want all human personnel currently on coalition installations transferred to our ships.
And, then, we want to be left alone.
And, if we refuse?
Sarah gestured to her tactical display, where the positions of human warships formed a perfect sphere around the station. Counselor, you have approximately 50,000 beings aboard that station. I have 47 warships, each carrying enough firepower to level a continent.
Do the mathematics.
The alien leader's mandibles clicked rapidly.
You would commit mass murder over a diplomatic dispute? Counselor, Sarah said quietly, do you know what the hegemony did to the human colony on Vega 7? They used a plague weapon. Biological warfare that specifically targeted human genetic markers.
1 billion people died over the course of 6 months.
Children, elderly, everyone.
They died slowly, painfully, while hegemony forces prevented aid ships from approaching.
Sarah's voice remained level, but something in her eyes made the alien take a step backward. Do you know what this coalition did in response? Zarthek didn't answer.
You issued a statement expressing concern about the loss of life.
You formed a commission to study biological weapons. You passed a resolution condemning the use of such weapons in future conflicts. You did absolutely nothing to the hegemony itself.
She leaned forward. So please, counselor, don't lecture me about mass murder. You've been accomplices to it for 3 decades. The only difference is that when we kill your people, we'll at least have the courtesy to do it quickly. On her tactical display, Sarah could see alien vessels beginning to move, some trying to retreat to safer distances, others moving to form defensive positions. None of them seemed to understand that there was no safe distance from human weapons, no defensive position that would matter if this conversation went wrong. Admiral Chen, came a new voice, and Sarah recognized the melodious tones of Counselor Lyrian from the ethereal collective.
Surely we can find a peaceful resolution to this situation.
Humanity has always been committed to diplomatic solutions. Humanity was committed to diplomatic solutions, Sarah corrected.
Past tense. That commitment ended when we realized that diplomacy only works when all parties operate in good faith. You don't. We have made mistakes. You've enabled genocide, Sarah cut her off. You've legitimized slavery. You've created a system where the only thing that matters is whether you have enough political connections to avoid consequences for your actions. That's not a mistake. That's a choice.
She turned to Commander Park.
What's the status on passenger transfer? Ambassador Vasquez and her delegation are aboard the Transport Horizon.
All other human personnel have been evacuated from coalition installations throughout this system.
Excellent. Sarah turned back to the communication channel. Counselor Zarthek, your people are safe. Our people are safe. This is where we part ways. Admiral, please. The coalition needs humanity.
The stabilizing influence you provide, the coalition, Sarah said, needs to learn to provide its own stability.
For 30 years, you've used human idealism as a shield against the consequences of your own moral cowardice.
That shield has been withdrawn. She paused, looking directly into the camera. But, here's the thing you should understand, we're not just taking our ships home. We're taking our knowledge, our technology, our industrial capacity, our food production, our medical expertise. Everything you've come to rely on from the silent species. The implications of her words began to register on alien faces across the communication channel. 40% of the coalition's manufacturing base is human-operated, Sarah continued.
60% of your medical supplies come from human worlds. 70% of your food distribution network relies on human logistics.
Your mining operations, your energy production, your transportation infrastructure, all of it depends on human participation. She smiled, and it was the same pleasant expression humans had been giving the galaxy for 3 decades. Good luck replacing all of that while you're forming committees to study the problem.
Sarah gestured to her communications officer. Cut all channels.
The screen went dark, leaving the bridge of the Retribution in relative quiet. Through the viewport, she could see coalition vessels scrambling to respond to the sudden realization that the galaxy had just fundamentally changed. All vessels, she broadcast to the human fleet, begin withdrawal. Full military honors for our departure. What happened next would be remembered in military academies across human space for centuries to come. 47 warships, moving in perfect synchronization, fired their weapons into empty space as they retreated. Not at targets, not in threat, but in salute. A 21-gun salute fired by enough firepower to crack planets, a formal military goodbye to a relationship that had lasted 30 years. The message was unmistakable: humanity was leaving, but not in defeat. They were departing as equals, with honor, with strength, and with the absolute certainty that they would never again accept the role of the galaxy's useful idiots. As the human fleet entered hyperspace, Admiral Sarah Chen looked one last time at the Coalition station growing smaller in the distance. Somewhere aboard that structure, alien leaders were beginning to understand that they had just lost the one species that had been holding their civilization together. Soon, they would also understand that they had gained something far more dangerous, an enemy that knew all their weaknesses, held grudges for 30 years, and had finally stopped playing by rules that only applied to humans. The real war was about to begin. 6 months after the Exodus, the galaxy began to understand what they had lost.
Captain Marcus Webb stood on the observation deck of the UES Vengeance, watching through reinforced transparisteel as the Kethvar homeworld burned.
Not the pretty, controlled burning of military precision, but the ugly, desperate burning of a civilization that had suddenly discovered what happened when you spent 30 years making enemies of the people who maintained your infrastructure.
"Captain," his executive officer reported, "the Kethvar government is requesting a ceasefire. They're offering full reparations for the Vega 7 atrocity." Marcus didn't turn from the viewport.
Below, he could see the crystalline spires of the Kethvar capital city cracking under the stress of system-wide power failures. Beautiful structures that had stood for millennia, brought down not by human weapons but by the simple absence of human engineering expertise. "After 30 years and 1 billion dead, they want to negotiate," he said quietly.
How generous of them.
It had taken exactly 3 months for the galaxy to realize the true scope of their dependence on humanity. The first signs had been subtle: delayed shipments, communication networks running inefficiently, mining operations producing lower yields.
Then, the problems cascaded. Food distribution systems failed. Medical supplies ran short. Entire star systems found themselves cut off when the human-operated relay networks went dark.
The Coalition had tried to replace human expertise with their own people, of course. They discovered that while many species could maintain human-designed systems, none of them truly understood the underlying principles. It was like trying to operate a computer by memorizing which buttons to push without comprehending how electricity worked. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Chen."
Marcus turned from the viewport. "Put her through." Admiral Sarah Chen appeared on the main screen, speaking from the bridge of the Retribution somewhere in the Hegemony's territory.
Behind her, Marcus could see the tactical displays showing the ongoing siege of 17 Hegemony worlds.
"Marcus," Sarah said, "what's your status?" "Kethvar Prime's orbital defenses are down.
Their fleet is scattered. They're calling for a ceasefire and offering reparations."
Sarah nodded grimly. "Same story here. The Hegemony is suddenly very interested in peace talks.
They've discovered that conquering worlds is much harder when your supply lines collapse every time you try to move beyond your core systems."
Marcus understood.
The Hegemony had built their empire on the foundation of Coalition infrastructure that had been designed and maintained by human engineers. Without that foundation, their war machine was falling apart faster than they could fix it.
"What are your orders, Admiral?"
"The same as they've been for 6 months, Sarah replied.
"We're not here to conquer. We're here to remind them that actions have consequences.
Keep the pressure on until they truly understand what they've lost." Through the bridge speakers, Marcus could hear another transmission coming in, this one from the Coalition leadership. He gestured to his communications officer. "This is High Counselor Zarthek of the Galactic Coalition," the familiar insectoid voice announced. "We are calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to diplomatic negotiations." Marcus looked at Admiral Chen, who shrugged.
"Might as well hear what they have to say. Put him through to fleet-wide." The screen split to show both Admiral Chen and High Counselor Zarthek. The alien leader looked haggard, his usually immaculate carapace showing signs of stress.
Behind him, Marcus could see the Coalition Emergency Command Center, bustling with activity as staff members tried to manage a galaxy-spanning crisis.
"Admiral Chen," Zarthek began, "the Coalition is prepared to offer substantial concessions to end this conflict. Full recognition of human sovereignty, preferred trading status, seats on all major councils. Counselor, Sarah interrupted, you seem to be under the impression that we want something from you. The alien leader's mandibles clicked in confusion. Then, what are your terms for ending hostilities? Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing her words carefully. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone speaking for an entire species. Our terms are simple. We want you to remember. When the next species comes to you for help, when the next colony gets massacred, when the next genocide unfolds while you form committees to study the situation, we want you to remember what happened when humanity got tired of watching. She gestured to something off-screen, and Marcus knew she was indicating the tactical displays that showed human fleets operating throughout coalition space. We want you to understand that idealism backed by force is not the same thing as idealism without consequences. For 30 years, you treated us like naive children who would accept any atrocity as long as you gave us pretty words about diplomatic solutions. That version of humanity is gone. High Counselor Zarthak leaned forward. But, what do you want us to do? The coalition cannot become a military dictatorship. We cannot simply impose justice by force, why not? Sarah's question was delivered with such casual directness that it seemed to knock the wind out of the alien politician. You impose everything else by force. You impose your trade routes by force. You impose your territorial boundaries by force. You impose your political systems by force. The only thing you refuse to impose by force is justice. Marcus watched the alien leader struggle with this concept, and he understood the problem. The coalition had been built on the principle that all cultures were equally valid, that all species had the right to self-determination, that force should only be used as a last resort. It was a beautiful ideal that had created a system where the most ruthless species could commit any atrocity they wanted as long as they were willing to sit through committee meetings afterward. Admiral, Zarthak said finally, if humanity withdraws from galactic civilization entirely, millions of innocent beings will suffer. Your own moral principles, our moral principles, Sarah cut him off, do not include enabling genocide by providing infrastructure to genocidal regimes. For 30 years, human engineers maintained the hyperspace relays that let hegemony fleets travel to their target worlds. Human doctors treated hegemony soldiers so they could go back to murdering civilians. Human manufacturers provided supplies that were used in weapons of mass destruction. She paused, and Marcus could see the weight of those decades in her expression. We were accomplices, Counselor. And we're done being accomplices. On Marcus's tactical display, alerts were appearing as coalition fleets throughout the galaxy attempted to coordinate responses to human military action. But, coordination required communication networks. Communication networks required the hyperspace relay system. And, the hyperspace relay system had been built and maintained by human technicians who were no longer available. Captain Webb, his executive officer reported, were receiving a transmission from the surface of Kefvar Prime. It's not their government, it's coming from a refugee camp. Marcus frowned. Put it through. The screen shifted to show a group of crystalline beings, their normally beautiful forms dulled by exhaustion and despair. The speaker appeared to be young, her crystal structure still showing the clarity of youth despite the stress fractures that indicated recent trauma. Human ships, she said in heavily accented Standard Galactic, please. We are not soldiers. We are not government. We are just people trying to survive. Many of us worked to stop what our leaders did to your colony. Many of us protested the killings. Please don't let us die for their crimes. Marcus felt something twist in his stomach. This was the part of war that the politicians never talked about in their speeches about justice and consequences. The part where innocent people suffered for the crimes of their leaders, where children paid the price for decisions they had never been allowed to influence. On the split screen, he could see Admiral Chen watching the same transmission, her face showing the same internal struggle. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, what are your orders? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Captain, you are authorized to provide humanitarian aid to civilian populations on Kefvar Prime. Medical supplies, food, basic infrastructure repair.
But no military assistance, no technological transfers, no long-term commitments.
Marcus nodded. Understood, Admiral. But High Counselor Zarthek was not satisfied.
This proves that humanity still holds to its moral principles. You cannot simply abandon the innocent beings who, Counselor, Admiral Chen said, we're not abandoning them. We're refusing to subsidize their oppression.
There's a difference.
She gestured again to her off-screen displays. For 30 years, human idealism enabled coalition in action. We provided the stability, the infrastructure, the moral authority that allowed you to maintain a system where genocide was acceptable as long as it was committed by politically connected species.
We're not going to make that mistake again. Marcus understood what she was really saying.
Humanity would help where they could, but they would no longer provide the institutional support that allowed the coalition to function. No more human engineers maintaining the systems that enabled galactic civilization.
No more human diplomats legitimizing a system that treated atrocity as a policy disagreement.
No more human soldiers dying to protect worlds whose governments would commit genocide the moment they thought they could get away with it.
What happens now? Zarthek asked.
Admiral Chen looked directly into the camera, and Marcus knew that her next words would be remembered across the galaxy for centuries.
Now you learn to be the civilization you always claimed to be. Without human infrastructure to hold you together. Without human idealism to provide moral cover for your inaction.
Without human military power to protect you from the consequences of your own cowardice.
She paused. Maybe you'll build something better. Maybe you'll create a galactic civilization that actually stands for justice instead of just talking about it.
Maybe you'll prove that idealism can exist without naivety.
Another pause.
Or maybe you'll tear each other apart without us to keep the lights on.
Either way, it won't be humanity's problem anymore.
The transmission ended, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the view of Kethvar Prime burning below. On his tactical display, he could see human fleets throughout the galaxy beginning their withdrawal, pulling back to the defensive perimeters around human space. The war was ending not with a peace treaty or a negotiated settlement, but with humanity simply walking away from a galaxy that had never deserved them.
In the months that followed, some coalition species would learn to maintain their own infrastructure.
Some would develop their own principles of justice backed by force. Some would create smaller, more responsive governments that actually protected their people instead of just managing their exploitation.
Others would fall into chaos, civil war, and systemic collapse.
But that was no longer humanity's concern. They had tried for 30 years to be the moral center of a galaxy that didn't want morality, only the appearance of it. They had been the engineers, the doctors, the diplomats, the soldiers who made galactic civilization possible while being treated as junior partners in their own idealistic project.
Now they were something else entirely.
Not the silent species, not the galaxy's useful idiots, not the naive idealists who could be counted on to do the right thing regardless of how they were treated in return. Now they were the people who remembered everything, forgave nothing, and had finally learned that sometimes the most moral thing you can do is walk away from people who don't want to be saved.
The galaxy would never be the same.
And that, Captain Marcus Webb thought as he watched the last of the Kethvar Defense Fleet surrender, was exactly the point.